Let's talk about you for a moment, Ambassador. You are one of the world's foremost historians of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. How have you brought that wealth of knowledge and expertise and that historical context to your role now at the State Department?
It's come in very sadly, particularly in the past 8 months, very, very handy, if one can say that. I recognize it when I see it. I've studied it so long. Not only have I studied it, but as you well know, Jonathan, I was subjected to it when I was put on trial in London, sued for libel by a Holocaust denier. I saw it up close and personal for 12 weeks in the courtroom. Um, it often I know of what I speak on a very personal level. I can also put things in a historical context. In the intro to this interview, you said you the reference was that I compared this to the 1930s. Now I want to be more explicit here. I don't compare the situation we're seeing today to 1938 or 1939, when the Nazi regime was at the height of its power, was oppressing Jews horrifically, was beginning the war that, of course, would lead to the annihilation of one out of every three Jews on the face of the earth. I talk about 1931, or even maybe 1928, 29, when Weimar Germany, a new democracy, the interwar democracy in Germany, was in a very fragile state and was being attacked by these forces of Nazism who were relying so specifically on Jew hatred, pure and simple, the most vile kind of Jew hatred. And it was, it played right into the weaknesses of Weimar Germany. And the problem is, and it's not just Germany, it was other countries as well. The governments either were participating and supporting this kind of view, or we're looking the other way. Oh, it's not real. Oh, it's not important. Even in our country, just a little over a year ago, the Biden Harris administration released the first ever national strategy to combat anti Semitism. And I was privileged to be one of the people who spoke at the launch of the strategy from the White House. And we were in the executive office building, the building next to the White House, which used to be the home of the State Department. During that period, was the home of the State Department. And I acknowledged in my remarks introducing the strategy that I was speaking, but of yards, meters from where decisions were being made on who should be allowed into this country and who shouldn't, who should be allowed visas and who shouldn't, based on whether they were Jews or not. They ticked off all the other boxes, but because they were Jews, the State Department, officials in the State Department said no, don't let them in. So and today, so that was then. Today it's very different. Today I just came back from Scandinavia, where a number of countries have issued national plans on fighting anti-Semitism, where countries have officials who address anti-Semitism. We will be gathering next month in July in Buenos Aires, many of the envoys who deal with this issue, to discuss how our governments are doing, what can we do better, how can we cooperate. We hope to introduce best practices, guidelines for fighting anti-Semitism. So the good news, let me start with the good news. I'm going to get to the bad news. Just hold on. Not surprisingly, the good news is that today, more often than not, governments are standing up to address it. And that's a sea change from the 1930s, where we began this conversation. The difference is, or the bad news is, that we haven't seen that in the whole of society. And not to knock my host, the Washington Post, or the media, but the media group, the media in general, and even the Washington Post to a certain degree in particular, has often fostered that view. Fostered that, I don't think consciously let, I'm not suggesting that at all, let's spread anti-Semitism. But when it talks about Jewish interests, when it talks about rich, powerful Jews forced the New York City police to bring down the encampment, or when on college campuses, on the stellar campuses of our country, Graduation speeches are given about rich and powerful people who tried to stop me from coming here. When we see overt anti Semitism in other parts of society, amongst some of our leading students, again, at our leading campuses, and not just in this country, but abroad as well, I worry. So the irony is today we see governments taking this seriously. When I travel the world, and since I've entered office, I've made, I think, 35 country visits to maybe 25 different countries. In most cases, governments recognize this because the
Mhm.
important thing is, and before we talked about anti-Semitism as a threat to democracy, it's not, and Jonathan, it's not just a threat to democracy, it's a threat to national security and national stability. Bad actors, malign influencers, be they other governments, be they NGOs, be they terrorist organizations, be they people with active internet, bots, etc., use this issue of anti-Semitism as a way of stirring up the pot, as a way of creating hostility between groups, as a way of making democracies look like failed states. During the COVID epidemic, the height of the COVID epidemic, we know that there were foreign countries, Russia amongst them, that were putting up pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine
Mhm.
postings on the internet. Now, why would you do pro and anti? It wasn't the vaccines you were concerned about. It's you wanted Americans to be yelling at each other. You wanted Americans to feel like, oh my God, our society is crumbling. Even those who weren't yelling stood aside and said, what's wrong with our society? So my challenge is when I go to these other countries is think of anti-Semitism as a multi-layered way, as a threat to Jews. Think of it as a threat to democracy, as we've talked about, and think about it as a threat to national security and stability. This is a national security threat which has to be taken seriously, not just by governments, but by whole of society.